When we think of proposals today, the image that comes to mind is often universal. A nervous partner kneeling down, a sparkling diamond ring in hand, and a heartfelt declaration of love. But what if I told you that in the ancient world, specifically in Greece, love and marriage proposals may not have involved diamonds at all, but rather apples? Yes, apples. It sounds almost comedic by modern standards. Could you really imagine a young man tossing a shiny red apple across the room to the woman of his dreams, hoping she would catch it, and in doing so, accept his love? This quirky claim has been circulating on blogs, social media, and even in casual conversations, sparking a blend of amusement and intrigue. But as with so many stories about the distant past, the truth is not quite as simple as the viral myth suggests. The reality is far more layered, involving mythology, symbolism, and the way human beings have always looked for objects to embody love and desire. In this series, we are going to peel back those layers, myth by myth, story by story, to find out what throwing an apple really meant in the context of ancient Greek culture, and whether it could genuinely be considered a proposal. To begin our journey, we need to understand the place of apples in the ancient world. Unlike today, where apples are a common snack you can pick up at the grocery store, in antiquity they were special. Apples carried symbolism. They appeared in myths, and they were often associated with fertility, beauty, and divine favor. In Greece, apples were strongly linked to the goddess Aphrodite, the deity who embodied love, beauty, passion, and desire. Just as roses might be gifted as symbols of love in our time, apples in ancient Greece carried a similar romantic charge. But the connection wasn't invented out of thin air. It was rooted in legendary stories that had shaped the Greek imagination for centuries. The most famous of these stories is the tale of the Judgment of Paris, where a golden apple, inscribed with the words "for the fairest," sparked a rivalry among goddesses that ultimately led to the Trojan War. In that single moment, the apple became something far greater than a fruit. It was transformed into a token of beauty, competition, and, most importantly, desire. As Greek myths spread and were retold across generations, the apple gained layers of meaning. For example, in the story of Atalanta, the swift-footed maiden who refused to marry unless her suitor could outrun her, apples again took center stage. A clever young man named Hippomenes was able to distract Atalanta during the race by dropping golden apples given to him by Aphrodite. The apples slowed her down just enough for him to win, and with victory came her hand in marriage. Here again, the apple was a tool, not just of divine magic, but of seduction, persuasion, and ultimately, union. Notice the pattern. Apples weren't casual snacks in Greek storytelling. They were instruments that changed destinies. And so, it is not hard to see how later generations might have interpreted the act of tossing an apple as more than just play. It became linked to love, to attraction, and to proposals. But here's where things get interesting. Ancient sources rarely describe apple throwing as a formal proposal in the way we might think of it today. Rather, the act was a symbolic gesture, a playful or even seductive move that carried meaning because of its mythological associations. Imagine you were a young man in ancient Athens, hoping to signal your affection without putting it into direct words. You might toss an apple in the direction of the person you admired. If they picked it up, smiled, or engaged with the gesture, you would take it as encouragement. If they ignored it or left the apple where it lay, you might get the hint. In this way, the apple became a tool of communication, a language of love rooted in myth, not a formal contract of marriage. Yet over time, storytellers, writers, and later interpreters began to exaggerate this idea, turning it into the amusing claim we hear today, that throwing an apple was the equivalent of dropping to one knee with a ring. Still, before we rush to dismiss this as nothing more than a silly myth, it's worth reflecting on why such stories stick with us. The Apollos proposal myth isn't just about fruit or even about Greece. It's about how human beings across history have used symbols to express emotions that are difficult to put into words. Whether it's roses on Valentine's Day, engagement rings, or golden apples, we continually turn to objects to make the invisible visible. Love, after all, is intangible, and culture provides us with physical tokens that allow us to show what we feel. The ancient Greeks, like us, were not immune to this impulse. Their apple-tossing gestures may never have been official proposals, but they were part of a broader human tradition of expressing passion through symbols. And it is here, in this overlap between myth and reality, that the true story begins to unfold. In the next section, we will dive deeper into the mythological roots of the apple, exploring the judgment of Paris in detail and unpacking how a single golden fruit became forever tied to love and beauty. By understanding that foundation, we will see more clearly why later traditions might have mistaken apple throwing for an act of proposal, and why the truth is both stranger and more fascinating than the myth itself. If we are to understand why the apple became such a powerful symbol of love and attraction in Greek culture, we need to return to one of the most famous myths in all of ancient literature, the judgment of Paris. This story, which lies at the heart of the Trojan War cycle, begins not with kings or soldiers, but with a single golden apple. It is a story of divine rivalry, human desire, and consequences that would ripple across centuries of storytelling. More than any other myth, the judgment of Paris explains why apples came to embody beauty, romance, and seduction, and why tossing one in someone's direction carried far greater meaning than the fruit's simple appearance might suggest. The tale begins at a wedding feast, specifically the marriage of Peleus, a mortal, to the sea goddess Thetis. All of the gods and goddesses of Olympus had been invited, with one notable exception, Eris, the goddess of strife and discord. Insulted at being left out, Eris decided to make her presence felt anyway. She arrived at the celebration carrying a gleaming golden apple, inscribed with just 3 fateful words, "For the fairest." Then, with a mischievous smile, she tossed it among the assembled guests and disappeared. It was a gesture designed to ignite chaos, and it worked spectacularly. Immediately, 3 of the most powerful goddesses claimed the apple for themselves: Hera, queen of the gods; Athena, goddess of wisdom and war; and Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. Their quarrel could not be settled among themselves. Each believed that she alone deserved to be recognized as the fairest, and so they turned to Zeus, king of the gods, to serve as judge. Zeus, however, wisely declined to make such a dangerous decision. Instead, he passed the responsibility to Paris, a young Trojan prince known for his good looks, but not for his wisdom. Paris was faced with an impossible choice. Each goddess attempted to bribe him with tempting rewards. Hera promised him political power and dominion over kingdoms. Athena offered him wisdom and victory in war. Aphrodite, however, made a different kind of offer. She promised him the love of the most beautiful mortal woman in the world, Helen of Sparta. Paris, swayed by desire, chose Aphrodite and awarded her the golden apple. This choice set off a chain of events that would ultimately lead to the Trojan War, one of the most famous conflicts in myth and literature. Helen, the prize Aphrodite had promised, was already married to King Menelaus of Sparta. When Paris claimed her as his own, either through seduction or abduction, the Greeks launched a massive expedition to reclaim her, leading to a 10-year war immortalized in Homer's Iliad. All of it, the betrayal, the battles, the destruction of Troy, raced back to a single fruit tossed at a wedding feast. The golden apple had become more than an object. It was a catalyst for passion, rivalry, and destiny. What matters for our exploration, however, is not the war itself, but the symbolic role of the apple in this myth. In awarding the apple to Aphrodite, Paris effectively declared that the fruit represented beauty, desire, and the irresistible power of love. The apple became her token, and by extension, a symbol of romantic allure in the Greek imagination. To throw an apple, therefore, was not just to toss a piece of fruit. It was to invoke the authority of Aphrodite, to say, "I see beauty in you, and I desire you." The gesture carried a weight of mythology behind it, transforming a mundane act into something charged with meaning. It is also important to note how this myth circulated through Greek culture. The judgment of Paris was depicted in art, vase paintings, and poetry for centuries. Audiences who saw or heard the story retold would have recognized immediately the apple's symbolic meaning. Just as modern audiences understand the symbolism of roses or engagement rings without needing it explained, ancient Greeks would have seen the apple as shorthand for beauty and attraction. When someone alluded to apples in poetry or gesture, the myth of Paris and Aphrodite stood in the background, enriching the symbolism with divine and romantic significance. The apple's role in this myth also highlights an interesting truth about symbolism in general. Objects take on meaning not because of what they are, but because of the stories we attach to them. A golden apple in itself is nothing but a piece of fruit, but in the context of the judgment of Paris, it became an icon of passion and choice. Over time, those layers of meaning became embedded in Greek cultural consciousness. When later poets and lovers used apples in romantic contexts, they were not inventing a new symbol out of thin air. They were drawing upon a myth already charged with emotional and cultural weight. This is why some traditions and later interpretations describe apple throwing as a proposal or a declaration of love. It was not that tossing an apple was literally equivalent to signing a marriage contract, but rather that the apple was so deeply tied to Aphrodite and the idea of irresistible beauty that the gesture communicated desire without words. In a society that valued cleverness, symbolism, and illusion, such an act could speak volumes. In summary, the judgment of Paris gave the apple its first and most enduring association with love and desire in Greek culture. A goddess of strife threw the apple as a weapon of discord, but in Paris's hands it became a prize of beauty, a token of desire, and a spark for one of mythology's greatest love stories. That legacy lingered in every later use of the apple as a symbol of romance. And, as we will see in the next section, it was not the only myth to give the apple its seductive power. The story of Atalanta and Hippomenes shows us yet another way in which this seemingly ordinary fruit became intertwined with love, pursuit, and marriage. If the judgment of Paris gave the apple its place as a token of desire in the divine world, the story of Atalanta brought that symbolism firmly into the realm of human relationships. This myth, retold in countless variations across Greek literature, is a tale of speed, cleverness, divine intervention, and above all, the seductive power of apples. Unlike the apple of discord, which set gods and goddesses against each other, the apples in Atalanta's story became instruments of courtship, a way for a mortal man to win a woman's hand in marriage. It is in this tale that we find one of the strongest connections between apples and proposals, though even here, the reality is more complex than a simple catch the apple, marry the man equation. Atalanta was no ordinary woman. She was born a princess but abandoned at birth, raised instead by a she-bear and later by hunters. From this unusual upbringing, she grew into a fierce huntress, famed for her skill with the bow and her unmatched speed on foot. She became a devoted follower of Artemis, the virgin goddess of the hunt, and vowed to remain unmarried. Yet her beauty attracted countless suitors, eager to win her as a bride. To deter them, Atalanta devised a challenge. Any man who wished to marry her must first beat her in a foot race. The conditions were brutal. If he lost, he would be executed. Confident in her own speed, Atalanta accepted race after race, leaving a trail of defeated and dead suitors behind her. She seemed destined to remain free and unattached. Enter Hippomenes, sometimes called Melanion in certain versions of the myth. Unlike the others, Hippomenes did not rely on strength or recklessness alone. Before attempting the deadly race, he prayed to Aphrodite for help. The goddess of love, ever eager to meddle in mortal affairs, gave him 3 golden apples from her sacred garden. These apples were not ordinary fruit. They were dazzling, irresistible, and imbued with Aphrodite's divine charm. With these gifts in hand, Hippomenes approached the challenge with a plan that was more cunning than reckless. When the race began, Atalanta quickly surged ahead, her speed proving once again why so many men had lost before him. But Hippomenes was ready. At just the right moment, he pulled out one of the golden apples and tossed it onto the track ahead of her. The gleam of the fruit caught Atalanta's eye. Though she was determined to win, she could not resist pausing to pick it up. That brief hesitation allowed Hippomenes to gain ground. Twice more he repeated the trick, each time tossing a golden apple, each time slowing Atalanta just enough. By the end of the race, the strategy had worked. Hippomenes crossed the finish line first, claiming both victory and Atalanta's hand in marriage. On the surface, this story seems like a straightforward example of the apple functioning as a marriage token. Hippomenes used apples to win Atalanta as his bride. Surely, one might say, this is the origin of the apple proposal tradition. But the truth is more nuanced. In this myth, the apples are not simply objects of affection. They are tools of distraction, symbols of Aphrodite's power to disrupt even the strongest vows and desires. Atalanta had sworn herself to Artemis, vowing never to marry, yet the golden apples of Aphrodite intervened. It was not Hippomenes alone who triumphed, but Aphrodite herself, asserting that love and desire will always find a way. The apples here represent the irresistible pull of attraction, a force that can derail even the most determined resistance. What makes this myth especially fascinating is the way it blends agency and surrender. Atalanta was not tricked into marriage in the way some myths portray women as passive objects of exchange. She was a formidable competitor, a woman who chose to race, who fought for her own autonomy. And yet, the lure of the golden apples caused her to pause, to bend, to lose. Was it her choice to pick them up, or was it the irresistible magic of Aphrodite compelling her? Ancient audiences may have debated this question. But either way, the apples served as the bridge between resistance and union, between independence and marriage. For later storytellers and interpreters, the symbolism of this myth was clear. Apples were not just fruits but instruments of seduction and courtship. They could change destinies, redirect lives, and bring lovers together. In a world where direct romantic declarations might be frowned upon or considered improper, the apple offered a symbolic language. To toss an apple could be to say, "I desire you, I want you, I claim you." To pick it up was to acknowledge, perhaps reluctantly, that desire. This is why the myth of Atalanta and Hippomenes matters in our exploration. It shows us that apple throwing, while never codified as a formal proposal, was nonetheless deeply entangled with the themes of love, pursuit, and marriage. It reveals how mythology gave everyday gestures layers of meaning that transcended the ordinary. To the Greeks, the apple was not just a fruit. It was Aphrodite's gift, a token that could bind lovers together even against their will. Of course, as with the judgment of Paris, the story does not end happily ever after. In many versions of the myth, Hippomenes and Atalanta later offend Aphrodite by failing to honor her properly. In anger, she curses them, leading to their downfall. This darker twist serves as a reminder of the risks involved in meddling with divine gifts and the peril of forgetting to respect the power behind symbols. Yet even in its tragic ending, the story underscores the central theme. Apples are never innocent in Greek mythology. They are charged with desire, power, and fate. So, when later traditions claimed that men in ancient Greece would throw apples as a proposal of marriage, they were drawing on myths like Atalanta's race. They saw in the apple not just a fruit but a narrative device, a shortcut to express longing and union. Whether or not such gestures were ever formal custom is debatable, but the myth left behind a powerful legacy that shaped how apples were perceived for centuries. In the next section, we will turn to another fascinating story, the tale of Acontius and Cydippe, where an apple inscribed with words of love became a literal binding contract. Unlike the playful distraction of Atalanta's race, this myth reveals the apple's power to trap someone in a vow of marriage. And it is here that the line between symbol and reality blurs even further. If the myths of Paris and Atalanta demonstrated the apple's power as a symbol of desire and seduction, the story of Acontius and Cydippe takes us one step further. In this tale, the apple is no longer a mere token to be tossed or a dazzling distraction. It becomes a vessel for words, a literal contract that binds two people together in marriage. What makes this myth particularly fascinating is how it blurs the line between symbolism and legal reality, showing us that the Greeks not only played with metaphors but also believed in the binding power of spoken vows. By writing upon an apple and tossing it toward the object of his affection, Acontius set in motion a chain of events that demonstrates both the creativity and the cunning of ancient lovers, and how easily myth and ritual could intertwine. The story begins on the island of Delos, one of the most sacred places in the Greek world. It was here that Acontius, a young man of modest background, first laid eyes on Cydippe, a beautiful maiden from a wealthy Athenian family. He fell for her instantly, overcome by a passion so strong that he despaired of ever winning her in the usual way. Cydippe was far above his station, and he knew that her wealthy parents would never consent to a marriage between them. Faced with this obstacle, Acontius devised a plan that was as ingenious as it was risky. While attending a religious festival in honor of Artemis, Acontius picked up a ripe apple and inscribed upon its skin the words, "I swear by Artemis that I will marry Acontius." He then tossed the apple in Cydippe's direction. Curious, she picked it up and, perhaps not realizing the trap, read the words aloud. To the ancient Greeks, this act was no mere recital. By speaking the vow aloud, and especially by invoking the goddess Artemis as witness, Cydippe had bound herself to it. Oaths and vows were sacred in Greek culture, and breaking them was considered an offense not only against the person involved, but against the gods themselves. Without knowing it, Cydippe had just promised to marry Acontius, and from that moment on, she was ensnared. What followed was a struggle between divine will and human resistance. When Cydippe's parents attempted to arrange other marriages for her, strange misfortunes began to occur. In some versions of the story, Cydippe fell gravely ill each time her wedding day approached, struck down by mysterious fevers that no physician could cure. In others, the gods themselves sent warnings or omens, making it clear that her vow to Acontius could not be ignored. Finally, after repeated setbacks and divine interventions, her parents realized that resisting the vow was futile. Reluctantly, they agreed to the union, and Cydippe was married to Acontius, just as the inscribed apple had foretold. The story of Acontius and Cydippe is striking for several reasons. First, it shows us that the apple had become a recognized medium for romantic expression, something that could carry words of love, rather like a letter or a token. But unlike a love letter, the apple had the power of myth behind it. By inscribing an oath upon a fruit so closely associated with Aphrodite and desire, Acontius elevated his message from a simple declaration to a binding contract, one that even the gods enforced. Second, it illustrates the seriousness with which the Greeks treated spoken vows. In a world without written contracts for such matters, the spoken word, especially when uttered in a sacred context, was law. To speak was to bind oneself, and to break that oath was to invite divine punishment. At the same time, this myth raises questions about agency and consent. Did Cydip truly choose Acontius, or was she trapped by his clever trick? To modern audiences, the story may feel unsettling, even manipulative, but in the cultural logic of the Greeks, it served as an example of cunning and the irresistible power of fate. Just as Paris was fated to choose Aphrodite, and Atalanta was fated to pause for the golden apples, Cydip was fated to speak the words that bound her to Acontius. The apple, in each case, is not just a fruit, but a symbol of inevitability, of the way desire and destiny intertwine in human life. Later poets and storytellers drew heavily on this myth, using it as evidence that apples were more than playful tokens. They could serve as instruments of binding love. When later commentators claimed that throwing an apple could function as a proposal of marriage, they may well have had the story of Acontius and Cydip in mind. After all, what could be more direct than tossing someone an apple inscribed with a vow? If they picked it up and read it, the bond was sealed. In this way, the myth gave a narrative foundation to the idea of apple throwing as a proposal, even if it was never a widespread practice in everyday Greek society. It is also worth noting how the myth of Acontius and Cydip has echoes in other cultural traditions. Across the ancient world, we find examples of words inscribed on objects, strings, tablets, even textiles, that carried vows of love or devotion. The apple in this case was simply the Greek version of that practice, made powerful by its connection to Aphrodite and to the sacred act of oath-taking. By combining symbol and word, Acontius ensured that his declaration could not be ignored, and in doing so, he secured a place for apples in the lore of marriage itself. Thus, in the tale of Acontius and Cydip, the apple becomes something unique, a bridge between symbol and speech, between gesture and contract. It was no longer simply about desire or distraction. It was about binding two lives together under the watchful eyes of the gods. And while the story may not reflect a literal custom practiced by everyday Greeks, it helped cement the image of the apple as a vehicle for love, proposals, and destiny. In the next section, we will step back from myth and examine the historical reality. Did Greeks truly throw apples as proposals in real life, or is this merely a poetic exaggeration? To answer this, we must explore what ancient sources actually say about love, marriage, and symbolic gestures, and how later generations may have misunderstood or embellished them. Up to this point, we have explored the great myths that surround the apple in Greek culture. Paris choosing Aphrodite, Hippomenes distracting Atalanta, and Acontius trapping Cydip with a cleverly inscribed vow. Each of these stories has left behind a powerful legacy, shaping the way apples have been remembered as tokens of love, seduction, and even marriage. But now we must ask the critical question: did ordinary ancient Greeks actually use apples as a formal proposal, the way so many modern blog posts and viral claims suggest? Was there truly a custom of throwing apples to signal marriage? Or are we dealing with a misunderstanding born from myth, poetry, and the human love of romantic symbolism? To answer this, we have to step away from myth and look at evidence. Ancient Greek society, particularly in the classical period, was deeply structured when it came to love and marriage. Marriage was not primarily a matter of romance. It was a social contract between families. Fathers arranged marriages for daughters, and the process was heavily tied to dowries, alliances, and property. The romantic ideals celebrated in myth and poetry rarely lined up with the realities of family life. In this context, the idea that a young man could toss an apple at a woman and thereby propose marriage seems far less plausible. Marriage negotiations were serious affairs involving family elders, not flirtatious fruit throwing. That said, apples did appear in Greek poetry and literature as symbols of love. Several fragments from ancient poets, particularly from the Hellenistic and later periods, use the imagery of apples as metaphors for attraction. One notable example comes from the poet Anacreon, who described love in terms of apples hanging just out of reach. Other poets wrote verses where apples were tossed as gifts of affection or symbols of longing. These poetic gestures, however, were very different from formal marriage proposals. They belonged to the world of courtship, seduction, and playful love rather than contractual union. In other words, apples may have been used as love tokens, but not as binding proposals. Where, then, does the claim of apple proposals come from? The answer lies partly in later interpretation. Roman writers, centuries after the classical Greek period, sometimes repeated or reshaped Greek myths in ways that blurred the line between story and custom. Later still, Byzantine commentators and medieval storytellers amplified these ideas, presenting symbolic gestures as if they had been literal practices. Over time, what began as myth and metaphor hardened into what people believed was historical reality. Modern writers, eager for quirky fun facts about the past, often repeat these claims without distinguishing between myth and custom. Thus, the idea that throwing apples was an ancient form of proposal spread widely, even though solid historical evidence is thin. It is also important to consider the role of Aphrodite in this confusion. Because apples were so strongly linked to her, any gesture involving the fruit carried romantic undertones. A man tossing an apple to a woman could indeed be interpreted as a declaration of affection, invoking the goddess's blessing, but that is not the same thing as a marriage proposal. The distinction may seem subtle, but it is critical. Romantic gestures existed outside the formal structures of marriage, just as today people might give flowers, write poetry, or send gifts without those actions being binding proposals. The apple, then, was part of this symbolic, playful language of romance. Interestingly, some scholars argue that the misunderstanding may also come from mistranslations. Ancient Greek texts often used metaphorical language, and when later readers took these metaphors literally, they turned symbolic acts into supposed customs. For example, when a poet described throwing an apple as shorthand for confessing desire, later audiences may have imagined actual men tossing apples in public as proposals. In reality, the phrase may have been no more literal than our modern expressions like wearing your heart on your sleeve or giving someone your hand in marriage. So, the verdict, the evidence suggests that while apples were deeply symbolic of love and desire in Greek culture, there was no standardized custom of proposing marriage by throwing one. Instead, what existed was a rich tapestry of mythological associations, poetic imagery, and playful romantic gestures that later got exaggerated into a supposed tradition. Apples were indeed tokens of love, but the leap from symbol of attraction to official proposal is a modern invention. And yet, there is something telling about the endurance of this idea. The very fact that people want to believe in apple proposals speaks to the human desire for romance and whimsy in history. We long to imagine the ancients as passionate and impulsive, throwing fruit across rooms to declare love, rather than as practical negotiators of dowries and property. The apple proposal myth, then, survives not because it was true, but because it captures our imagination. It blends the mundane with the magical, the ordinary with the divine, just as the Greeks themselves did in their myths. In the end, the truth may actually be more fascinating than the myth. While Greeks did not formally propose marriage with apples, the fruit's symbolic power permeated their culture so deeply that it became a universal shorthand for love. To throw an apple was not to propose, but it was to flirt, to seduce, to acknowledge desire in a way everyone understood. And perhaps that is why the story still resonates. Even if it never happened in reality, it reveals something timeless about how humans seek creative, symbolic ways to express emotions that words alone cannot carry. In the next section, we will explore how later cultures, from Rome to the medieval world, picked up on these Greek ideas and transformed them further. Did apple symbolism survive beyond antiquity, and how did the myth of apple throwing evolve as it traveled through time? The answers will show us just how far this quirky fruit's romantic journey extended. By the time Greek myths had become well known across the Mediterranean, the apple was already firmly established as a symbol of beauty, love, and desire. But the story didn't stop in Greece. When the Romans adopted Greek culture, they also absorbed its myths, symbols, and poetic traditions. In Roman hands, the apple continued to thrive as a romantic emblem, and from there it traveled into medieval Europe, influencing love stories, art, and even folklore for centuries to come. Tracing this journey helps us understand how a simple fruit became such a universal token of affection. So much so that people today still talk about apple proposals. As if they were real, the Romans were great borrowers of Greek culture. They took Greek gods and gave them Latin names, retold Greek myths with their own twist, and integrated Greek symbols into their daily lives. The apple was no exception. In Roman poetry, especially in the works of Ovid, the fruit appeared again and again as a metaphor for love. Ovid's Metamorphoses, which retold the story of Atalanta and Hippomenes, made the golden apples famous among Roman readers. But Roman poets also expanded the apple's use in more personal ways. Love poems often featured apples as gifts exchanged between lovers, tokens of affection that carried the same symbolic charge as flowers or jewelry might today. A young man might give an apple to the woman he adored, not as a formal proposal, but as a sign of desire, a tradition that echoes the Greek practice of using symbolic gestures in courtship. What's interesting is that in Roman times, the apple also became associated with fertility and abundance. Apples appeared in wedding ceremonies and were sometimes shared by newlyweds as symbols of prosperity in their new life together. Roman mosaics, frescoes, and decorative art often depicted apples alongside grapes and pomegranates, emphasizing their role as fruits of love and life. By blending Greek myth with Roman ritual, the apple's meaning grew richer and more layered, moving from a purely symbolic object of desire to a fruit that represented marital harmony and domestic joy. When the Roman Empire gave way to the medieval world, the symbolism of the apple traveled even further. Christian writers inherited both the Greek and Roman traditions, but reinterpreted the apple through a biblical lens. The story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, though it never explicitly mentions apples in the original Hebrew text, became strongly associated with the fruit in later Christian tradition. The apple in this context symbolized temptation, sin, and the fall of humanity. Yet the romantic connotations from Greece and Rome never entirely disappeared. In medieval courtly love poetry, apples sometimes reappeared as tokens of affection, and in folk traditions, They were used in rituals of divination and matchmaking. For example, young women might peel an apple and toss the peel over their shoulder, believing that the shape it formed would reveal the initials of their future husband. This blending of traditions created a fascinating duality. On one hand, the apple was dangerous, the fruit of temptation, the cause of downfall. On the other, it was delightful, the fruit of love, beauty, and fertility. This paradox made the apple endlessly compelling in stories, rituals, and art. The medieval imagination loved symbols that carried both light and shadow, and the apple fit perfectly. It could be both the cause of sin and the promise of love, depending on the context. By the time of the Renaissance, artists and poets across Europe embraced the apple as a universal emblem of romance. Paintings often depicted Venus, the Roman Aphrodite, holding an apple, echoing the judgment of Paris. Meanwhile, apple imagery slipped into love songs, wedding customs, and even fairy tales. Think of the poisoned apple in Snow White, a story with roots in European folklore, where the apple once again serves as a powerful object of temptation and destiny. So, while ancient Greeks probably never proposed marriage by tossing apples, their myths set in motion a symbolic tradition that traveled across cultures and centuries. From Aphrodite to Ovid, from Eden to medieval folk rituals, the apple never lost its connection to love and desire. Instead, it gained new meanings, carrying its romantic weight all the way into modern times. In the final section, we will bring everything together, asking why this myth of Greeks proposing with apples continues to captivate us today. Is it because of its roots in ancient stories, or is it because we love to imagine a past filled with whimsical gestures of romance? We've journeyed from Greek mythology to Roman poetry, from medieval folklore to Renaissance art, all through the curious lens of a single fruit. Along the way, we discovered that the idea of ancient Greeks proposing marriage by throwing apples is not supported by historical evidence. Yet it continues to spread as one of those irresistible fun facts about the past. Why does this myth endure? Why do we love the thought of an apple flying through the air as a stand-in for a diamond ring and a solemn vow? The answer lies not just in history, but in the timeless human desire for symbols, stories, and a touch of magic in the way we express love. First, the myth survives because it is simple and visual. In an age when people scroll quickly through headlines and social media posts, the image of a young Greek man tossing an apple at the woman he loves is both funny and memorable. It's far easier to imagine and share than the reality of ancient Greek marriage negotiations, which were often dry and businesslike. The apple proposal captures the romance we want to see in the past, not the practicality that actually existed. In this way, the myth works almost like a fairy tale, condensing complex traditions into a single, charming gesture that feels universal. Second, the myth thrives because it is rooted in real symbolism. The Greeks did associate apples with love, beauty, and Aphrodite. The myths of Paris, Atalanta, and Acontius all gave the fruit a powerful aura, and Greek poets used apple imagery in their verses about desire. So while formal proposals may never have involved fruit, the connection between apples and romance was real. Modern audiences sense that authenticity. Even if they don't know the full stories, they recognize that the myth springs from genuine cultural associations. That hint of truth makes the claim believable and attractive. Third, the apple proposal myth resonates because it reflects something timeless about human nature. Across cultures and centuries, people have used objects to express emotions. Rings, flowers, letters, charms, even emojis today. Love is invisible, intangible, and often overwhelming. We need symbols to make it tangible, to carry meaning that words sometimes fail to express. The ancient Greeks used apples, just as we use roses on Valentine's Day. Whether or not they threw them as formal proposals is less important than the fact that apples functioned as love tokens, and that symbolism speaks across time. There's also the element of playfulness. The act of tossing an apple is light-hearted, almost mischievous. It fits with the way we often imagine young love, filled with games, teasing, and daring gestures. In a world where marriage was usually arranged by families, the image of lovers communicating through something as simple as an apple feels refreshing and rebellious. It suggests that even in highly structured societies, people found ways to sneak in their own creativity and romance. That playful quality makes the story appealing to modern audiences who long for whimsy in history. Finally, the endurance of the apple proposal myth says as much about us as it does about the Greeks. We want history to be romantic, filled with charming gestures rather than harsh realities. It is comforting to imagine that people in the past expressed love in ways we can recognize, tossing apples instead of swiping right, offering fruit instead of jewelry. Myths like this bridge the gap between past and present, allowing us to see ourselves in the ancients, to feel connected across time by the universal desire to love and be loved. So, did the ancient Greeks really propose by flinging apples? No, not in the way the myth suggests, but in another sense, yes. They used apples to symbolize desire, to flirt, to hint at passion, to invoke Aphrodite's blessing. And perhaps that's why the myth still works today. It doesn't matter if the gesture was ever a formal tradition. What matters is that the apple continues to tell a story about love, one that has traveled for thousands of years, from sacred festivals in Delos to viral posts on the internet. In the end, the myth of the apple proposal reminds us that history is not just about facts. It is also about imagination, about the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of human emotions. And maybe, just maybe, that's why the apple remains so irresistible, not only as a fruit, but as a timeless symbol of romance.